In the 39 Articles of Religion, specifically the article that speaks of the Lord's Supper, there's a section at the very end, it's a smaller section, that says, "The sacrament of the Lord's Supper was not by Christ's ordinance reserved, carried about, lifted up, or worshipped." And I've had some people comment on this and ask me, what do I think specifically of this idea of elevating the chalice and elevating the host during the consecration? Is this forbidden by the 39 Articles? And if so, why do so many Anglicans do it? Well, first, what I'd like to point out is the fact that it is a very widespread practice in Anglicanism. I have been to many Anglican churches, some a little bit lower church, some a little bit higher church, and even in a lot of the lower church settings, you will still see this elevation of the host. And so is this what the article is forbidding? I believe in my heart of hearts that when I read this article, the concern listed there is a concern surrounding the particular Roman Catholic conception of the Mass at the time, or at least the perception that the Reformers had. I think it's very clear to say that Rome has never taught dogmatically that Christ is re-sacrificed every single Sunday, every single Mass anew. However, the language, I think we could all agree, at some points, at least in history, was a little bit ambiguous when it came to exactly what Catholics believed about the sacrifice of the Mass and what was happening. And so the Reformers' concern when writing this was largely surrounding the idea that they did not want to do anything that would enable or give the appearance or influence the laity to see what they were doing as some kind of real re-offering of Jesus Christ's sacrifice. The book of Hebrews says Christ died once for all, therefore, why would we do anything that would look as though that's not the case? I think this is a fair point, and I think it's a fair concern. However, one thing I will point out is it doesn't say the sacrament of the Lord's Supper was not by Christ's ordinance reserved, carried about, lifted up, or worshipped. Therefore, we must refrain from all of these things. That's not listed in the article. What's explicitly said in the article is that the sacrament of the Lord's Supper was not by Christ's ordinance used in these particular ways. Christ never said, reserve the sacrament. Christ never said, carry the sacrament. Christ never said, lift the sacrament up or worship the sacrament. It's an argument from silence, but there's nothing in the explicit teaching of Scripture that also says that because Christ didn't explicitly command these things, that these things are always and unequivocally to be condemned. Now, in the case of the elevation, the lifting up of the host during the consecration, I find this to be a very appropriate symbol. And I believe it's an appropriate symbol because there is a real sacrifice going on in the Mass. There is a real offering up that is taking place. And if we were to just stand with the elements and say the words of institution over the elements, that wouldn't necessarily be a false consecration. There are priests I know who don't elevate the elements. But it does diminish, I think, the picture of the sacrificial nature of the supper. And you might be saying, well, Jonah, you just said the reformers' concern was exactly that. What are we communicating by this imagery? And so why would you say that was their concern and then go to say, hey, we should do the thing that concerned them for the very reason that it concerned them? I understand that might be confusing. However, I think what we have in Anglicanism, which Rome did not have in the medieval period, is we have a much more robust understanding of catechesis and a much more robust understanding of theology generally on a lay level. People coming into an Anglican church, people who are learning about Anglicanism, who are asking questions of their priests and of other leaders in the church, should know very clearly that Anglicans do not believe that Christ is being sacrificed over and over and over again. And I've actually seen in churches where the host is elevated, people have come up and said, hey, I noticed that you did this with the host. What are you trying to communicate there? And that leads to a very good and important discussion regarding the nature of the Eucharist, the nature of the sacrifice in the Eucharist. And so when it comes to the question, can and should the elements of the Lord's Supper be lifted up? I would simply say it does not have to be, but there is nothing wrong with the imagery associated with it. And the Reformers' concerns have largely been put to rest in a lot of recent conversation and development in theology. Even Anglicans have become more comfortable with the idea of a sacrifice. There's another article that speaks about the one oblation of Christ finished upon the cross, and it says that the sacrifices of masses are what are condemned. Sacrifices, plural. However, what we as Anglicans teach is not the sacrifices of the masses, but the sacrifice of the Mass, singular. There is one sacrifice, which is the once-for-all sacrifice of Christ on Calvary, and that once-for-all sacrifice is made present, represented each and every time that the Mass is celebrated. It is an eternal sacrifice. As we read in the book of Revelation, John sees a lamb who had been slain from the foundations of the world. Now, how can that be when Christ's death is temporal and took place in temporal time? I think the best way to understand this is the idea that Christ's sacrifice, though it happened historically once, never to be repeated, the ongoing impact, the efficacy of the sacrifice, the reality of it continues for eternity. For it is only through the eternal nature of the sacrifice that any of us have hope of salvation 2,000 years, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, ad infinitum into the future years. We can't have hope in anything else if the sacrifice of Christ someday is no longer efficacious, is no longer real and present and impacting our lives in a sacramental way. So, to make a long story short, should we reserve, carry, lift, or worship the sacrament? That is to the discretion of each priest, but there is nothing specifically forbidden in Scripture regarding these things. And in the articles themselves, the only thing pointed out is that Christ did not explicitly command these things, not that Scripture explicitly condemns them. I hope that's helpful, and I'll talk to you guys in the next video.